He laughed at her. To the millionaire, the black maid was nothing more than a servant. Ordinary, invisible, forgettable. But the moment she opened her mouth, revealing who she truly was, the entire room froze. What she said didn't just silence him. It shocked everyone who thought they knew her story. Stay with me until the end, because this twist will leave you speechless. And before we begin, take a second to like this video, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Country Club gleamed under crystal chandeliers, filled with the city's wealthiest elite celebrating another successful charity auction. Among the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits, one figure moved quietly through the crowd, carrying a silver tray of champagne glasses. Her name was Grace Thompson, and to everyone in that room, she was simply the help. At 62 years old, Grace had worked as a maid and catering assistant for over 15 years. Her graying hair was neatly pulled back, her black uniform pressed to perfection, and her demeanor respectfully quiet. She had mastered the art of being invisible, moving through these gatherings like a shadow, refilling glasses and clearing tables without drawing attention to herself. But tonight would be different. Tonight, her carefully constructed facade would crumble in the most unexpected way. Richard Blackwell stood at the center of the room's attention, his booming voice carrying across the marble floors as he regaled a circle of admirers with tales of his latest business conquest. At 45, he had built a real estate empire worth over $300 million, and he never let anyone forget it. His perfectly styled silver hair, custom Italian suit, and gold Rolex spoke of wealth accumulated through ruthless ambition and calculated moves. Blackwell had a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. He was known for his sharp tongue, his dismissive attitude toward anyone he deemed beneath his station, and his particular disdain for service workers. To him, they were interchangeable parts in the machine of his privileged world, existing solely to make his life more comfortable. As Grace approached his group with her tray of fresh champagne, she moved with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to navigate these social minefields without causing ripples. She had served at dozens of events like this one, always maintaining her professional composure even when faced with condescending remarks or outright rudeness. But Richard Blackwell was in a particularly foul mood that evening. His latest development project had hit unexpected snags with the City Planning Commission, and he was looking for someone to take his frustration out on. When Grace stepped forward to offer him a fresh glass of champagne, replacing his empty one, he saw the perfect target. "Excuse me," Blackwell said loudly, his voice cutting through the nearby conversations. "Did I ask for another drink?" His tone was sharp, designed to humiliate. Several heads turned in their direction, and Grace felt the familiar knot of tension form in her stomach. "I apologize, sir," Grace replied quietly, her voice steady despite the growing attention. "I was simply refreshing the glasses as instructed." Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down with obvious disdain. "Instructed by whom? Do you see me talking to important people here? Do you understand that your job is to wait until you're needed, not interrupt conversations between your betters?" The circle of wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. This was Richard Blackwell's show, and they had all learned long ago that crossing him meant social and business suicide. Grace stood perfectly still, maintaining her composure as she had been trained to do through years of similar encounters. "Furthermore," Blackwell continued, his voice growing louder and more theatrical, "when you do serve drinks, try not to look so pleased with yourself. This isn't your party, and you're not a guest. You're the help. Know your place." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, the kind that comes from people uncomfortable with what they're witnessing, but too cowardly to intervene. Grace felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but she had developed thick skin over the years. She had endured worse than Richard Blackwell's verbal assault. "Of course, sir," she replied, her voice remaining level. "My apologies for the interruption." But Blackwell wasn't finished. Something about Grace's dignified response only fueled his anger further. Perhaps it was the way she maintained her composure, or the fact that she didn't cower under his attack. Whatever it was, he felt compelled to push harder. "You know what I find amusing about people like you," he said, gesturing dismissively toward Grace while addressing his audience. "You go through life thinking you're important, thinking you matter in some significant way. But the truth is, you're completely replaceable. There are 1,000 women just like you who could do your job just as poorly." The room had grown uncomfortably quiet now. Even those who were accustomed to Blackwell's cruelty recognized that he was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. But Grace remained standing there, her tray steady in her hands, her expression unchanged. "You probably tell yourself stories about how dignified your work is, how you're contributing something meaningful to society," Blackwell continued, warming to his theme. "But let's be honest here. You're nothing more than a servant, a glorified janitor, and the sooner you accept that reality, the better off everyone will be." Margaret Whitmore, the wife of a prominent banker, finally found her voice. "Richard, perhaps that's enough," she said quietly, but her words carried little conviction. She was as afraid of Blackwell's wrath as everyone else in the room. "Enough?" Blackwell turned toward her with a predatory smile. "I'm just having a conversation with our server here about the importance of understanding one's station in life. Surely there's nothing wrong with that." He turned back to Grace, his eyes gleaming with malicious pleasure. "Tell me, what's your name? I want to make sure the catering company knows how you interrupted my conversation tonight." "Grace Thompson," she replied simply, her voice still steady despite the mounting humiliation. "Grace Thompson," Blackwell repeated mockingly. "Well, Grace Thompson, let me give you some free advice. The next time you're working an event like this, remember that you're here to serve, not to be seen or heard. These people," he gestured grandly toward the crowd, "have earned their place in this room through intelligence, hard work, and success. You're here because someone needs to carry the drinks." The cruelty in his words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Several guests looked away, unable to meet Grace's eyes, ashamed of their silence, but unwilling to risk Blackwell's retaliation. The charity auction that was supposed to be about helping others had devolved into a public humiliation of someone who couldn't fight back. But as Blackwell prepared to deliver what he intended as his final, crushing blow, something shifted in Grace's expression. For the first time since the confrontation began, a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't the submissive smile of someone trying to appease an angry customer. It was something else entirely. Something that made Richard Blackwell pause mid-sentence. "Is something amusing to you?" he asked, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Grace set her tray down on a nearby table with deliberate care. When she straightened up, there was something different in her posture, something that hadn't been there moments before. The invisible servant was beginning to disappear, and in her place stood someone else entirely. "You want to know who I am, Mr. Blackwell?" Grace said, her voice carrying a new authority that cut through the tension like a blade. "You want to understand exactly who you've been speaking to for the past 5 minutes?" The room had gone completely silent now. Even the soft, classical music from the corner quartet seemed to fade into the background. Richard Blackwell's confident smirk began to waver as he sensed something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between them. Grace reached into the small pocket of her uniform and pulled out a simple leather wallet. From it, she extracted a business card and held it up for everyone to see. The movement was deliberate, calculated, and filled with a quiet power that commanded attention. "My name is Dr. Grace Thompson," she began, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "And while you were busy explaining to me how replaceable and insignificant I am, you failed to recognize that you were speaking to the founder and CEO of Thompson Medical Research Institute." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Several people leaned forward, straining to hear every word. Richard Blackwell's face had gone pale, but Grace wasn't finished. "Perhaps the name doesn't immediately ring a bell for you, Mr. Blackwell," So let me provide some context. Thompson Medical Research Institute has developed three of the most significant cancer treatment protocols currently in use worldwide. Our research has saved approximately 200,000 lives over the past decade, and our company is valued at just over $800 million. The champagne glass in Blackwell's hand began to tremble slightly. Around the room, phones were discreetly being pulled from purses and pockets as guests began frantically searching for information about Dr. Grace Thompson. But those are just numbers, Grace continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. What might interest you more, given your obvious concern with wealth and status, is that Forbes magazine featured me on their cover just 6 months ago as one of the most influential women in biotechnology. Perhaps you missed that issue? Margaret Whitmore's hand flew to her mouth in recognition. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're the Grace Thompson, the one who developed the revolutionary treatment for childhood leukemia." Grace nodded gracefully. "Among other things, yes. Though I must say, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm surprised you recognize the name. Most people in rooms like this are far too busy discussing their latest acquisitions to pay attention to medical breakthroughs that actually save lives." The pointed comment landed like a physical blow. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware of how shallow their earlier conversations had been compared to the work of the woman they had just watched being humiliated. "You see, Mr. Blackwell," Grace continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of her authority. "While you were building your empire by buying and selling properties, I was working 18-hour days in research laboratories, developing treatments that give children a chance to see their next birthday. While you were learning how to intimidate service workers, I was learning how to defeat diseases that have plagued humanity for centuries." Richard Blackwell opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man who had been so articulate in his cruelty just minutes before now found himself completely speechless. "I'm curious about something," Grace said, tilting her head slightly. "You mentioned that I should know my place. Well, according to last year's tax returns, my place is apparently about $500 million above yours. Does that change your perspective on who should be showing respect to whom?" A nervous laugh escaped from someone in the crowd, quickly stifled when they realized the gravity of the situation they were witnessing. Grace picked up her tray again, but this time the action carried an entirely different meaning. "You asked why I'm here tonight, serving drinks instead of sitting at one of your tables as an honored guest. The answer is quite simple. I do this because it allows me to observe how people with wealth and privilege treat those they believe are beneath them. It's a fascinating study in human nature." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "You see, true character isn't revealed when someone thinks they're being watched by their peers. It's revealed when they think no one important is paying attention, when they believe they have power over someone who can't fight back." Dr. Thompson looked directly at Richard Blackwell, her gaze unwavering. "And what I've observed tonight, Mr. Blackwell, is that despite all your wealth and success, you have revealed yourself to be a fundamentally small person. A person who derives pleasure from humiliating others, who mistakes cruelty for strength, and who has confused having money with having worth." The silence in the room was deafening. Several guests were now openly staring at their phones, confirming the details of Dr. Thompson's identity. Others were looking at Richard Blackwell with expressions ranging from embarrassment to outright disgust. "But here's what I find most interesting, Doctor," Thompson continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture. "You assumed that because I was serving drinks, I must be uneducated, unimportant, and unworthy of basic human respect. You never considered that I might be here by choice, that I might have reasons you couldn't fathom, or that I might possess knowledge and accomplishments that dwarf your own." She gestured toward the crowd of wealthy guests. "How many brilliant minds do you think you've dismissed over the years, simply because they weren't wearing the right clothes or driving the right cars? How many opportunities have you missed Because you were too busy looking down on people to recognize their true value. Richard Blackwell finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I had no idea who you were. Dr. Thompson smiled, but there was no warmth in it. And that, Mr. Blackwell, is precisely the point. Your ignorance of my identity doesn't excuse your behavior. It exposes it. You didn't treat me poorly because you thought I was insignificant. You treated me poorly because you thought I was powerless to respond. She looked around the room, addressing the crowd of silent witnesses. How many of you knew who I was when you watched this man humiliate me? How many of you would have spoken up if you had recognized me from the start? The uncomfortable shuffling and averted gazes provided her answer, without anyone needing to speak. That's what I thought, Doctor, Thompson said softly. Your moral courage, it seems, is directly proportional to the social status of the victim. That's not courage at all. That's calculation. She walked over to Richard Blackwell with deliberate steps, her presence now commanding the attention of every person in that ballroom. The transformation was complete. The invisible servant had vanished, replaced by one of the most powerful women in modern medicine. Kaisatu, there's something else you should know about me, Mr. Blackwell, Dr. Thompson said, her voice carrying across the silent room. Something that makes this evening particularly meaningful for me. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. 23 years ago, I applied for a research position at Blackwell Industries. You had just started your company and were looking to diversify into medical real estate. I had recently completed my doctorate in molecular biology from Johns Hopkins, graduated summa cum laude, and had already published groundbreaking research on cellular regeneration. Richard Blackwell's face went from pale to ashen. He remembered that name now. Remembered the interview, remembered his decision. So I still have the rejection letter you sent me, Doctor. Thompson continued, unfolding the clipping. Would you like me to read it aloud? I've memorized it over the years. The room held its collective breath as she cleared her throat and began to recite. Dear Miss Thompson, while your academic credentials are impressive, we don't feel you would be a good fit for our company culture. We're looking for candidates who better align with our vision and values. We wish you success in finding a more suitable position elsewhere. She refolded the paper carefully. What you didn't say in that letter, but what you made crystal clear during our 15-minute interview, was that you couldn't imagine a young black woman from the inner city having anything valuable to contribute to your organization. You spent more time looking at your watch than listening to my presentation on revolutionary cancer treatments. Margaret Whitmore gasped audibly. Several other guests were now openly recording the confrontation on their phones, recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. But here's the beautiful irony of this moment, Doctor, Thompson said, her voice taking on a tone of quiet satisfaction. That rejection letter became the single most motivating force in my entire career. Every 18-hour day in the laboratory, every failed experiment, every grant application I wrote at 3 a.m, I did with your dismissal echoing in my mind. She walked closer to Blackwell, who seemed to shrink with each step she took toward him. You see, Mr. Blackwell, you didn't just reject a job applicant that day. You rejected a cure for childhood leukemia. You rejected treatments that have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. You rejected innovations that have revolutionized modern medicine. Dr. Thompson paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room like a heavy blanket. And do you know what the most delicious part of this story is? 3 years ago, your own company tried to buy Thompson Medical Research Institute. Your board of directors was so desperate to acquire our patents and research that they offered me $1.2 billion. Richard Blackwell's champagne glass slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered on the marble floor. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. I turned down your offer, of course, Doctor. Thompson continued with a slight smile. Not because the price wasn't right, but because I couldn't bear the thought of my life's work being associated with a man who judges people's worth by the color of their skin and the clothes they wear. She turned to address the entire room now, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing medical conferences and university symposiums. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand something important about what you've witnessed here tonight. This isn't just about one man's prejudice or one woman's success story. This is about a fundamental flaw in how our society assigns value to human beings. Dr. Thompson gestured toward her uniform. I chose to work these events not because I need the money, but because I wanted to experience firsthand how people with privilege and power treat those they perceive as powerless. What I've discovered over the past 2 years of doing this research is far more disturbing than I anticipated. She looked directly at several guests who had remained silent during Blackwell's earlier tirade. I've been cursed at by real estate moguls who couldn't spell molecule if their lives depended on it. I've been lectured about knowing my place by people whose greatest contribution to society is inheriting their father's money. I've been treated as invisible by individuals who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the research environments where I've spent my career. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Dr. Thompson's words hit their target with surgical precision. But the most revealing part of this experiment has been watching the bystanders, she continued. The people who witnessed cruelty and said nothing. The individuals who knew what they were seeing was wrong, but lacked the moral courage to speak up because they feared social consequences. Margaret Whitmore looked down at her hands, unable to meet Dr. Thompson's gaze. Several other guests found sudden interest in their shoes or their jewelry, anywhere but the woman who was holding up a mirror to their collective cowardice. "You want to know why I do this?" Dr. Thompson asked, her voice rising with passion. "Because every time I've been humiliated while wearing this uniform, I've remembered the young black girls in inner-city schools who dream of becoming scientists, but are told by guidance counselors that they should consider more realistic career paths. I've thought about the brilliant minds being wasted because people like Mr. Blackwell here can't see past their own prejudices." She walked back toward Richard Blackwell, who stood frozen like a deer in headlights. "Your rejection didn't destroy me, Mr. Blackwell. It forged me. It turned me into someone who would never give up, who would prove that excellence has no color, and that genius can emerge from anywhere." Dr. Thompson reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I'm curious about something. Let me show you what happened to the company that did hire me after you rejected me." She scrolled through her phone and held up a news article. Genesis Pharmaceuticals, the small biotech firm that took a chance on a young black woman you deemed unworthy. They're now worth $15 billion, primarily due to the patents and research I developed while working there. The same patents that your company desperately wanted to buy 3 years ago. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. $15 billion. The wealth that Richard Blackwell had walked away from because of his prejudice was almost incomprehensible. "But money isn't the real victory here," Dr. Thompson continued, her voice softening slightly. "The real victory is the 7-year-old girl in Detroit who celebrated her birthday last month because of a treatment I developed. The real victory is the grandmother in rural Alabama who got to see her grandson graduate because of research you deemed unworthy of your investment." She turned to face the entire room again, her presence commanding absolute attention. "I want everyone here to remember this moment. Remember that the person serving your drinks might be the person who saves your life someday. Remember that the immigrant cleaning your office might be the one who solves problems you never even knew existed. Remember that genius doesn't always come wrapped in the package you expect." Dr. Thompson picked up her tray again, but this time the gesture was purely symbolic. "Mr. Blackwell, I have one final question for you. Given everything you now know about who I am and what I've accomplished, would you like to revise your earlier assessment of my worth and my place in this world?" Richard Blackwell opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. His entire worldview had been shattered in the span of 15 minutes, and he found himself completely unable to process what had just happened to him. "I didn't think so," Dr. Thompson said with a slight nod. Some people are too invested in their prejudices to admit when they're wrong, even when the evidence is overwhelming. She began walking toward the exit, her head held high, her dignity intact and magnified by the evening's revelations. But just before reaching the door, she turned back one final time. "Oh, and Mr. Blackwell, that childhood leukemia treatment I developed? The one that saved thousands of lives? I'm donating the patent to the public domain next month. Every child in the world will have access to it, regardless of their family's ability to pay. That's what someone from my background chooses to do with the power and wealth you insisted I could never possess." The ballroom erupted into spontaneous applause as Dr. Grace Thompson walked out the door, leaving behind a room full of people who would never again make assumptions about someone based on their appearance or occupation. Richard Blackwell stood alone in the center of the room, abandoned by his former admirers, clutching the fragments of his shattered worldview. The man who had started the evening as the center of attention had become a cautionary tale about the price of prejudice and the danger of underestimating others. As the crowd began to disperse, whispered conversations filled the air. People were already pulling out their phones, calling friends and colleagues to share the story of what they had witnessed. Within hours, the tale would spread through social media, becoming a viral sensation that would define Richard Blackwell's reputation for years to come. But for Dr. Grace Thompson, driving home in her modest Honda Civic, the evening represented something far more significant than public vindication. It represented the completion of a journey that had begun 23 years earlier in a sterile office where a young woman's dreams had been dismissed without consideration. She had proven that excellence transcends prejudice, that genius can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is not anger or bitterness, but the quiet satisfaction of extraordinary achievement. The story of what happened that night at the Riverside Country Club would be told and retold countless times, but its true impact wouldn't be measured in social media shares or news coverage. It would be measured in the young minds it inspired, the prejudices it challenged, and the reminder it provided that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. The next morning, news outlets across the country picked up the story. Video footage from guests' phones had already gone viral on social media platforms, with millions of views and thousands of comments pouring in within hours. The hashtag Grace Thompson moment began trending worldwide as people shared their own experiences of being underestimated or misjudged based on appearances. But the real earthquake was just beginning to shake Richard Blackwell's carefully constructed empire. By noon, 3 major clients had canceled multi-million-dollar contracts with Blackwell Industries. The first call came from Harrison Development Group, whose CEO had been at the charity event the night before. "Richard, after what I witnessed last night, we can't in good conscience continue our partnership," Harrison said over the phone, his voice cold and professional. "Our company values don't align with the kind of behavior you displayed. Consider our contract terminated immediately." The second cancellation came from Metropolitan Bank, whose president had watched the entire confrontation unfold. The third was from the Riverside Medical Center Consortium. Ironically, the same institution that had benefited from Dr. Thompson's groundbreaking research over the years. Within 72 hours, Blackwell Industries had lost over $40 million in active contracts. But the financial damage was nothing compared to the social exile that followed. Country club memberships were quietly revoked. Invitations to exclusive events stopped arriving. Business associates who had once competed for his attention now avoided his calls entirely. Richard Blackwell found himself experiencing something he had never encountered before in his privileged life. He was being treated exactly the way he had treated others for decades. The difference was devastating. Meanwhile, Dr. Grace Thompson returned to her laboratory at the Thompson Medical Research Institute, where her team was putting the finishing touches on their latest breakthrough. The irony wasn't lost on her that while Blackwell's empire crumbled, Her research was on the verge of another major medical advancement. Her assistant, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, knocked on her office door. "Dr. Thompson, you have about 50 interview requests from news organizations. They all want to hear your side of the story from last night." Grace looked up from the research papers scattered across her desk. "Thank you, Maria, but I think I've said everything I need to say. Let our work speak for itself." But the story had taken on a life of its own. University professors began using the incident as a case study in business ethics courses. Medical schools invited Dr. Thompson to speak about perseverance and overcoming systemic barriers. The contrast between her response to rejection and Blackwell's response to criticism became a powerful lesson about character and resilience. 3 weeks later, Richard Blackwell sat alone in his penthouse office, staring at a stack of legal documents. His company was hemorrhaging money, his reputation was in ruins, and his social circle had evaporated overnight. The man who had once commanded respect through intimidation now found himself completely isolated. His lawyer, James Morrison, sat across from him with a grim expression. "Richard, we need to discuss your options. The board is calling for your resignation. Stock prices have dropped 30% since the incident. Several shareholders are threatening lawsuits, claiming your behavior has damaged the company's value and reputation." Blackwell looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline he had once felt he owned. "How did one conversation destroy everything I built over 20 years? Morrison leaned forward. "It wasn't one conversation, Richard. It was 20 years of conversations just like that one. The difference is this time, you said it to someone who had the power and platform to expose who you really are." The lawyer pulled out another document. "There's something else. The Thompson Medical Research Institute has announced they're establishing a scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing careers in science and medicine. They're calling it the Second Chances Initiative." Blackwell's hands trembled slightly. "Let me guess. They're using the publicity from our encounter to raise money for it." "Actually, no," Morrison replied. "Dr. Thompson is funding the entire program herself, $50 million of her own money. She's giving opportunities to people who might otherwise be overlooked or underestimated, just like she was." The weight of that revelation settled over Blackwell like a physical burden. While his world collapsed around him, Dr. Thompson was using her success to lift others up. The contrast couldn't have been more stark or more damning. Meanwhile, at Jefferson High School in downtown Birmingham, 17-year-old Keisha Williams sat in her guidance counselor's office, listening to advice that would have crushed her dreams just months earlier. "Keisha, I know you want to study medicine, but maybe you should consider something more practical," the counselor was saying. "The sciences are very competitive, and with your background," but Keisha interrupted with a confidence that surprised them both. "Have you heard of Dr. Grace Thompson?" The counselor paused. Everyone had heard the story by now. This story reminds us that genius doesn't wear a uniform, and greatness isn't defined by appearance. Dr. Grace Thompson showed us that true power comes not from tearing others down, but from lifting them up. While Richard Blackwell's empire crumbled under the weight of his own prejudice, her legacy continues to save lives and inspire dreams. Never judge someone by their circumstances, because the person you underestimate today might be the one who changes the world tomorrow. If this story moved you, smash that like button, subscribe for more incredible tales, and share this with someone who needs to remember that everyone deserves respect. What's your biggest takeaway from Grace's story? Let me know in the comments below.